1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
The name of the city is Tulsa. It is bold, young, alive, cosmopolitan. Go ahead, Renata. It has been billed as America. Excuse me. Okay.
Yeah, we'll just start over
All right.
now and we'll just go and see how it goes.
The name of the city is Tulsa. It is bold, young, alive, cosmopolitan. It has been billed as America's most beautiful city. It has often been called the oil capital of the world, water capital of the Southwest. It is the home of the J.C. National Headquarters. This has given it another title, Young Men's Capital of the World. For Oklahoma, it is perhaps an old city, because it did not spring up suddenly from a land run. Instead, it began as a Creek Indian village. It remained for more than 60 years in Indian hands and was not incorporated as a town until 1898. Creeks came from Alabama to settle this site on the Arkansas River. They arrived in 1836. They chose a site between the present 17th and 18th Streets and Cheyenne and Denver Avenues. A giant oak stood over them. This oak, their council oak, still stands on Cheyenne Avenue. They named their town Tulsa. It comes from the Creek word Tallahassee, meaning old town. The town later became known as Tulsa Town. But there is a great gap between a small tribal village and the great industrial Tulsa of today. What filled that gap? One factor was the Frisco Railroad decision to extend its line from Veneta to the Arkansas River. It was known oil was in the area, and this perhaps played a role. But this was not the main reason. A cattle path went through Tulsa, and there were plentiful grasslands there. The railroad was interested in hauling the cattle. If the Arkansas River had been located differently, the railroad operators would probably have plunged to a spot they liked better, the Pulpa, but they were not yet ready to build a bridge. Being at the end of the line meant you had to turn the trains around and to perform maintenance. People arrived to perform these services. Then merchants arrived to sell goods and services to those who were here. People arrived on the cattle drives about 3 times a year. They would trade and buy and celebrate when they came to town. Buildings began to spring up. Some were merchandise stores. Others provided entertainment. The area became a general distribution point, and yet Tulsa was a long way from being a city. It was merely the end of the line. The first business houses of Tulsa were flat-fronted. Their style reminds us of the Last Chance Saloon of the movies. But it was not to remain that way, even in those pioneer days. Robert P. Lynch decided to build a permanent building of masonry. This building was on the southeast corner of 1st and Main. He used all local materials. The stone was a large sandstone slab about 12 inches thick. It was quarried south of Catoosa and was hauled into Tulsa on wagons. This building had 2 stories. Mr. Lynch had his general merchandise store on the 1st floor. The 2nd floor was designed for offices. Other modern buildings were to come. 2 of them were the Tulsa Banking Building and the Gillette and Price Building. Tulsa then had about 4 square blocks. The streets were of dirt and were graded just enough to allow horse-drawn vehicles to move. Cat Creek was on the north side of the railroad. It was a wet weather stream with holes of water during dry weather. It furnished water for steam engines before wells were drilled. The streets were of dirt, alternately muddy and dusty. Once a townsman was asked why the town was laid out with only 80 feet between buildings. The answer was, why make it any wider? It would simply mean we would have to walk that much further through the mud. Since auto and air transportation did not exist, railroads were essential. Tulsa needed every rail line it could get. Businessmen who had settled in Tulsa were out to get these lines. When companies appeared disinterested, they put up a bounty for each railroad locating in Tulsa. The result? Eventually 5 railroads went through Tulsa at one time. A town had started, but the big story was still on its way. Tulsa was a cattle town and an agricultural center. There was almost no industry. That is, until something mighty important happened in 1901. On June 25th of that year, oil was discovered at nearby Red Fork. The news spread throughout the country. The further it spread, the bigger the gusher became. Actually, it produced about 100 barrels of oil per day. Tulsa was beginning to convert from a cow town to an oil town. But Red Fork did not bring the big rush to Tulsa. It was almost in the shadow of these oil gushers that the federal survey of the town site was completed. The base was the Frisco track. It started with Main Street. Avenues were named alphabetically for American cities. Eastern cities were on the east side, and western cities were on the west side of Main. But they could never have imagined how many of these streets there would someday be. The original town site was in the Creek Nation, but the Cherokee Nation was very close. Today, the city of Tulsa is in both nations. Now, I would say this around a little bit more. But the big story did not come until 1905. In that year, Robert Galbraith and Frank Chesley were drilling a wildcat on the Ida Glen allotment when they blew a well into production. The name, Glen Pool. It became famous everywhere as the richest small field in the world. Within 2 years, it was producing nearly 120,000 barrels a day out of 516 wells. Because of this field, Oklahoma entered statehood as the nation's leading. After this discovery, there was no stopping the growth of Tulsa. 2 stories was no longer high enough for a skyscraper. Tulsa's 5-story skyscraper was on the northwest corner of 2nd and Main. It was built in 1905. Everything in it was modern and up to date. There were water coolers on every floor. It even had an elevator, the first in Tulsa. Statehood came to Oklahoma in 1907. Tulsa, as an incorporated community, was only 9 years old at that time. But the folks of Tulsa were proud of their brand new state and of their fine young town. They wanted to tell the rest of the nation about it, and that's exactly what they did. They chartered a train which would carry 120 people and made an 18-day goodwill tour into the east. They went to Springfield, Missouri, and on to St. Louis. They went to Louisville and Cincinnati and Toledo. They went to Philadelphia, New York, and to Washington, D.C. And they came back by way of Chicago and Kansas City. Perhaps some might ask, what did you do it for? The answer comes from John Mayo, who made the trip. But this was not the first goodwill tour, and it was not to be the last. Only a few years earlier, the Tulsans had made another trip east. They brought with them a stunt roper from nearby Claremore. This young man had never been east of the Mississippi. Mrs. N.J. Gubser, whose husband made the trip, tells about it. Tulsa was growing fast, and something had to be done about the streets. It was soon to become an oil metropolis. It needed modern streets to accommodate the people who were flocking in. But the problem was solved. The streets were paved, and Tulsa was getting more modern every day. What did you find on these streets? Horses and mules and wagons mainly. But once in a while you would see one of those newfangled contraptions called an automobile. This machine was to become important to Tulsa in many ways. One is that it was to become the principal user of the petroleum, which had been discovered in such abundance around Tulsa. But even after the downtown streets were paved and autos were appearing, there were problems of dust and mud. If mud and dust were problems, the water problem was 10 times worse. The source of city water was the Arkansas River. Not only could you not drink it, it was not even fit to bathe in. People were buying bottled water, which was shipped in. But the answer to this problem must come later. Meanwhile, Tulsa was growing rapidly. Big names sprang up in the petroleum business in Tulsa, names which are almost legendary today. They are the men who discovered, drilled for, processed, and marketed their petroleum. Their names are preserved today on the trade names of some of the world's leading oil companies. Among these are Wade and Frank Phillips, Harry Sinclair, and W.G. Skelly. As Tulsa grew, there were sounds of construction, and sounds of construction meant that new buildings were rising. The Tulsa skyline was changing over and over again. Behind the hammering and the welding, a village became a town, and a town was becoming a city. The 5-story First National skyscraper was soon to be dwarfed by another building, the Cosden Building, 12 stories high on the southeast corner of 4th and Boston. That building stands today as the Mid-Continent Building. Then came the Phil Tower with its magnificent 23 stories. Only a year later, the Exchange National Bank overshadowed it with 28 stories. This is now the National Bank of Tulsa. But war stopped the building boom. It was not until after peace was signed that Tulsa started upward again. You know the story. Buildings which hover around 40 stories high, and more to come. In the culture of almost every civilization is the mythical phoenix, a bird which at the end of its life lights a fire and burns itself up. Out of the fire emerges a new and greater creature. This is no myth in the growth of a city. Where every giant building in Tulsa stands today, there were 1, 2, 3, and sometimes 4 earlier buildings. These structures served their purpose and were destroyed before larger and more modern buildings arose. Take the corner of 4th and Boston, where the magnificent Home Federal Savings and Loan Building stands today. At one time, it was a residence with an orchard in the backyard. Next, it was the home of the Presbyterian Church. Then the Pioneer Telephone Company had its headquarters there. It was when this third building was torn down that Home Federal arose 14 stories high. But we have gotten far ahead of our story. What happened to the mud in the water pipes? The answer, Lake Spavinaw. It was in 1924 that Lake Spavinaw was completed to supply clean, fresh Ozark Mountain water into Tulsa. This was perhaps the most important event for Tulsa, since Glen Pool was discovered in 1905. Where did money come from to build good things for Tulsa? There were many sources, of course. The Spavinaw Project shows one example of the teamwork of Tulsa's leaders. But this was only the first. Others were to follow. One of the biggest of these notes was for the airport. Another was for the stockyard. It represented people with vision and confidence working for Tulsa. But it takes more to build a city than oil or commerce or even people. Making a living is vital to a family. Economic health is vital to a community. But people must learn also how to live. This takes education, music, art, drama, and recreation. All are a part of the making of Tulsa. What about the culture of the earliest days of Tulsa? We asked one of the pioneers, Mrs. Kate Walker. And grew it did. Today, Tulsa is one of the great cultural centers of the United States. Few cities can boast an art museum as great as either Philbrook or Gill Creek. Tulsa has both of these institutions, and they attract thousands of people each year. The Tulsa Philharmonic is one of the finest symphonies in the country. Tulsa has opera, little theater, and civic ballet. It has a town hall lecture series and a dance theater. Tulsa schools are among the best, and the Tulsa Civic Center brings to the city the finest in culture and entertainment from throughout the world. The establishment of these cultural institutions for Tulsa are among the important dates in the city's history. And what about sporting events? Today, Tulsa has AAA baseball, a professional hockey team, college football, and basketball. It is a center for auto racing. Its golf courses attract top national events. It has wonderful facilities for participant sports. This interest in sports did not begin in the later years. It began when Tulsa was a village and was playing baseball against other villages in the area. Here is one of Tulsa's former baseball stars. And education? You know about Tulsa's fine public school system. But Tulsa also boasts two major colleges, Tulsa University and Oral Roberts University. What does higher education mean to Oklahomans? The answer comes from one of Tulsa's greats, a man whose own education came through self-study. But he believed in formal education and its importance. Who was he? One of the great builders of Tulsa and of Oklahoma, W.G. Skelly. Tulsa is a city of arts and music and sports and books. It has come a long way from the small town of 1898. Part of the growth can be seen in the Tulsa State Fair. It began as a community fair in 1903 in a tabernacle tent. In 1915, the Tulsa Free Fair was organized. In 1923, the fair was moved to the 240-acre site on which it is now located. Today, Tulsa boasts one of the largest fairs in the country. Its livestock building alone covers more than 10 acres under one roof. More than 1 million people attend each year. Yes, many great things have happened to Tulsa, but it is not by accident. It is because people with vision have made it so. No doubt they have done a lot of things wrong, but they have also done a lot of things right. A former president of the United States talked by telephone a few years ago to students in Tulsa. The occasion was when a school was named after him. He put it this way: in the history of Tulsa, there have been a few especially important events. The establishment of the community, the coming of the railroad lines, the discovery of Glen Pool, the year Tulsa brought Spavinaw water to its citizens, the year Philbrook and Gill Creek museums were given to the people of Tulsa, the year the airport was opened, the year the Civic Center was conceived. All were great events. But far from the least of all these occasions was the year 1971, when Tulsa gained water transportation through the Arkansas and Mississippi rivers to the Gulf of Mexico. The Tulsa Port of Catoosa is a long stride for Tulsa. It offers low-cost water transportation for bulky products. It provides a brand-new incentive for industries which are thinking about Tulsa. It didn't happen all at once. Nothing in Tulsa did, except perhaps the discovery of Glen Pool. It was the result of years of dreaming, of planning, of selling, of working, and of believing. But in the year 1971, it was completed. In the summer of that year, it was dedicated by the President of the United States. We have reached the present, but the end is not yet in sight. The village of Tulsatown, now the metropolis of Tulsa, is on the verge of new and greater growth. Like the phoenix of mythology, the hopes and aspirations of its people arise again and again from the ashes of the past. When it appears that the impetus of early leaders has died, new leaders with new enthusiasm arise to replace them. Growth continues, but more important than growth is the enthusiasm, the love, the feeling of its citizens for the city in which they live and whose future they are helping to build, an enthusiasm which knows no bounds and which is dedicated to the aspiration that Tulsa can and will be one of the great cities of the world. Oklahoma heritage. What does it mean? What is its importance? Is it relevant to the people of today? Our heritage is the sum of those things we have inherited. It includes ideas and knowledge, honors and dishonors, proud achievements, and grave mistakes. It includes good and bad. It is not perfect. It does not even approach perfection. On the other hand, it does include a lot of effort and a lot of sacrifices. What comprises this heritage of Oklahoma? Our heritage is in the lives of those who came before us. Today, all of us, individually as well as collectively, are creating what Oklahomans of tomorrow will call their heritage. We read in books and magazines of the lives of our forefathers and what they did. But the people who made our history were much more than words in a book. They were living personalities. They had thoughts and dreams. They shared ideas and ambitions. They laughed. They cried. They had proud achievements. They had great frustrations. But in living, in growing, in building, and even in making mistakes, they have given Oklahoma a proud heritage. Take the earliest days of Oklahoma Territory, April 22nd, 1889. A young man, then only 27 years old, rode the train into Guthrie to become its first postmaster. This man was to become a territorial congressman. He would be a leading attorney and a corporate organizer. In 1928, he would become the first person to be inducted into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. This man witnessed the first election ever held in the town that later became our first territorial capital. The date, April 25th, 1889. Telling of the experience, Dennis T. Flynn. Meanwhile, another town was starting up in the newly opened Oklahoma land. It was on the North Canadian. Meanwhile, another town was starting up in the newly opened Oklahoma land. It was on the North Canadian River. This town was destined later to become the state capital. A 21-year-old man came to this town site on the day of the run. He was destined to publish the first newspaper in Oklahoma City. He would later serve as president of Oklahoma A&M College. He was to become the author of the first comprehensive history of Oklahoma City. He would be inducted into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame in 1933, 5 years after it was organized. This man presided at Oklahoma City's first election on April 24, 1889. Here is how Dr. Angelo Scott described the election. Perhaps few people brought more color and showmanship to our pioneering state than did Pawnee Bill. As a boy, he lived in Bloomington, Illinois. Suffering from tuberculosis, he was given no chance to live by doctors of that day. Persuaded by a frontier butcher to move west, he was fed raw beef blood on the way out. Whether it was the beef blood or the clear, dry atmosphere of Oklahoma is open to question, but recover he did. He played a role in the Boomer movement. He was part of Buffalo Bill's show. Then he had his own show, which traveled over the country. He made the run of 1889 and settled in Pawnee. He was inducted into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame in 1934. Today, a state museum honors the name of Major Gordon W. Lilly, better known as Pawnee Bill. If you are an athletic fan of the Oklahoma State Cowboys, you know of Pistol Pete. But many Oklahomans do not know that the original Pistol Pete, before his death, was Frank Eaton of Perry. Frank Eaton followed the Chisholm Trail for 10 years prior to the run of '89 and witnessed every land run in the territory. In Cherokee history are many great names, but when the Cherokee Historical Society of Tahlequah organized its own Hall of Fame in 1971, the first person to be elected was the late Senator Robert Owen. He had been inducted into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame in 1941. Here's what he had to say 32 years ago on Indian Memories Day. Education has played an important role in Oklahoma. Even the self-educated, who lack the benefit of formal education, were quick to recognize this. One of the great leaders of Tulsa and of all Oklahoma, inducted into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame in 1939, made this comment: the name W.G. Skelly. Certainly, Skelly is a classic oil name in Tulsa, but it was another Oklahoman who made the discovery which vaulted Tulsa from a cow town to the oil capital of the world. The discovery, Glen Pool, the most productive oil field ever discovered. The discoverer, Robert Galbraith. The history of Oklahoma is dotted with colorful politicians, but if a vote were ever taken on who was Oklahoma's most colorful politician, it is doubtful if anyone could top our Constitutional Convention chairman, William H. Murray. As a high school student in Oklahoma City, during his term as governor, I remember vividly the pungent, orotund oratory which characterized Alfalfa Bill Murray. Sitting in what is now the Civic Center of Oklahoma City, he would launch a vitriolic attack on the three principal publications of that city. To quote, "They are," he said, "the triple harlots of journalism. They send their reporters to the governor's mansion to revile my wife and children. They remind me of those little girls in the beer halls of the oil field towns who would dangle their feet from the saloon windows and take anything from 3 coppers up. But, my friends, I can assure you, as long as I'm governor of Oklahoma, I intend to follow your interests." And old nesters in the crowd would slap their thighs and yell, "Yippee, Bill! Give 'em hell! We're free at teeth and toenail!" But when we talk of politics, and when we talk of color, we think first of the master of them all. He was not a politician, yet the entire world listened to his comments on the political scene. He was always an Oklahoman, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1932. But he belonged to the world until his tragic death in 1937. He liked everybody, and the things he said and wrote are part of the heritage of our nation. These men and women, along with many others, are living legends of Oklahoma. Their voices are the sounds of history. They represent some of the personalities who molded Oklahoma. Collectively, they represent the personality of our state. They are the people who made the tracks in which we walk today. We, the people of Oklahoma, remember them, and we salute these track makers.